the great majority of them were all for the big public vote of just trashing the Arndale Centre. Just get rid of the Arndale Centre and all our problems will be solved. It would have been very difficult, Arabs having been the engineers, because it barely took any damage at all. But I remember having a conversation at that time with Ian Simpson on the site, that is to say, wandering around the bits of the city close to Marks and Spencer, as close as we could get. And Ian asked if I got a pad with me and if I had a pen with me, and I had both, being a keen journalist. And he took the pad from me and he took the pen from me, and he said, "That's St. Anne's Church. That's the cathedral. I think we should be cutting through there." And as far as I know, that's the first time he drew what became the master plan, which Jason has just deliberated upon, and saying it was that was the key to the whole project. So saying, Ian, tell us more. Thank you.
Hi. Well, between Jason and Phil, they've told you everything I'm going to tell you, basically. But I'll try my best with a few slides to just touch on my thoughts about the approach that we took 20 years ago, which doesn't seem that long ago, but in the life of a city, it's nothing really. Manchester is very much work in progress. It's not about, aren't we clever, haven't we done well? Actually, we're doing okay, we're doing better than some of the provincial cities, but there's a hell of a long way to go. I'm a Mancunian by birth, and Manchester has always been my home city. I come from the poor northern part of the northwest, which actually started on Market Street here. Everything to the north of Market Street had no money. I'm from Haywood, and my parents are from Rochdale and Bury, and that goes on through Cheetham Hill, Collyhurst, all the way to Nelson, Colne, Blackburn, all those places that are desperately in need of connection, which is a real task. And Jason touched on it, is how we bring the city core out into those areas of deprivation. But interestingly enough, to the south of Market Street, through King Street, through the wealthy suburbs of Sale, Altrincham, Wilmslow, Alderley Edge, Cheshire, it's interesting that there's a barrier there. We had a real north-south divide. Also, you've got to remember what Manchester was like in those days. It's very easy to forget. It was good to know that Luke was living on top of the Arndale, along with, there were 300 or 400 people that lived in the city centre. Apart from Luke, a lot of them were caretakers. It wasn't a place that you lived. It was a 9-to-5 city. There were a few pubs, grotty nightclubs at the places like Pips behind the cathedral and Placemate, places that I'm sure Phil and I used to spend our time in, getting our car nicked and then having to walk back home. That's one of the memories I have of enjoying nightlife in Manchester. But also Market Street. There was a bus station on Market Street. The city centre was just full of traffic. There was a massive ugly ramp that ran up the middle of Market Street to a car park. And I've just walked down from Market Street to the station now and thinking, it's been transformational what's happened over this 20 years. So we had some car parks, and they're all surface car parks. The building we're in now was actually a car park derived from bomb damage from the Second World War. Nothing had happened really in that sense. It was pretty dire. There were one or two interesting nightclubs. Hacienda, I think, was still kicking by 96, was it? Dry Bar. And did Atlas Bar exist in those days? I can't remember, but that was a bar that we invested in and were owners of. This image here is an image I actually borrowed from the Dean of Manchester, from his office, which was an interesting photograph of the cathedral in splendid isolation. And I think it's worth just scrutinizing that image because the print works was derelict and empty. The Corn Exchange had flea markets in it on the ground floor. The site that we're on now had no cathedral gardens. Urbis wasn't here. There was no wider ambition to develop Noma. The Green Quarter didn't exist, and Victoria Station was nothing like it is now. And as you move closer towards the city, the delightful 60s monstrosity called the Shambles, of which there is now only the Ramada Hotel remaining, sits in place of historic streets that were there. I remember New Brown Street and other streets before the Arndale Centre in particular was built. The Arndale Centre itself, you can see the top right-hand corner there. It was a shopping mall dropped into a city. It had nothing to do with the city. It was all about inward looking. It didn't have hardly any entrance. That's why you could put a bus station at the side of it. It was not about the city or the streets or about enjoying moving across the city. It was a box that once you got inside, you couldn't get out, and the only way you could do out was spend money. I mean, that was the mental approach to it. And as Phil said, we had one idea right at the beginning, before the competition actually started. We didn't know we'd win the competition, but it was quite clear that we wanted to make that connection, because the area that we're in now is Manchester's old medieval quarter, the Hanging Ditch, Cheetham School, the Corn Exchange, the cathedral, the arches. You know, it's actually quite a historic piece of the city, completely detached. The city was just really moving to the south. It had no vision for the north of the city's core. So the idea of this arc that happened to go through where the Shambles and the Wellington pubs were, unfortunately. But it was very much about, well, we have to move them. Interestingly, of all the other competitors who put forward schemes, none of them moved those pubs. They all sort of worked around them in some way. But you had to have that line of sight between St. Anne's Square and what ultimately became Exchange Square. Jason has described the master plan, and I'm going to touch on 3 buildings that came out of that master plan work. One is this building that we're in now. The other one is the transport interchange. And the third one is number 1 Deansgate, all dating back to the turn of the last century, effectively. Sounds odd, that, doesn't it? Hey, Jason still looks young. I don't understand it. Anyway. This is what we were confronted with at the end of St. Anne's Square. Marks and Spencer's, and a beautiful 60s modernist monolith spanning, closing the end of the square. It wasn't even the main entrance to Marks and Spencer's. Jason showed you a really good shot of the Shambles pubs tucked in around the back. And I remember having the discussion with the Tadcaster Brewery, I think they were, who owned those pubs at the time, and having to go over to Yorkshire Drive and meet these Yorkshiremen who were, what do you mean you want to move our pubs? They earn a massive amount of money there. You'll never create something that's going to give us an income stream like the one we've got, tucked around the modernist buildings with a few pigeons floating around. I think they've changed their mind now. But one of the moves we did have to make, and I'm not going to dwell on that scheme, was actually to turn the buildings through 90 degrees, because we couldn't find a site that we could relocate the pubs on, because the pubs were a linear arrangement dating back to the original Victorian configuration of the streets. So we cranked them through 90 degrees to squeeze it on the site that was generously given over by the cathedral, because they had a building on that site that was demolished at the time. When I say generously given over, obviously they managed to prize out of the city council a full refurbishment and a visitor centre a little bit further down on Cateaton Street as a generous gesture for relocating those pubs. So everybody got a little bit of something out of it. And that was the vision that that we as a practice produced. We'd taken a little bit of artistic license there. We'd moved the cathedral over slightly because you can't actually see the cathedral if you look straight through. And the pubs are a little bit further back. But the idea of creating the first new street in this century, really, or last century, in Manchester, which became New Cathedral Street, leading onto a public space. I remember the sessions that we had, design sessions about the width of that street, whether it should curve, how you deal with the end of the street, because there was a level change linking down, and Martha's going to touch on the square and the relationship with that. But also, again, we were dealing with a threat to the city. There was a shopping centre being built over in Dumplington. I prefer that. I don't know why they changed the name. From Dumplington, which is how we referred to it as the Trafford Centre in those days. But it was a real threat to the city, to the economy of the city as a retail centre. And so that's, Jason eloquently referred to how the pressure was on, really, to rebuild the city. And again, the city council said, we're not just rebuilding what was there. We need a new vision for the city. And as a team, we were lucky to win the competition. We had a strong idea around which lots of other projects would spin off. But as part of that, we always felt it was important that we should also try and have some residential back in the city centre. It wasn't ever going to be back on the Arndale again. But also in those days, you couldn't really put residential on top of retail. It was commercial suicide in those days, and the agents and the landowners, primarily London companies who owned those sites, wouldn't allow that. And I'll touch on number 1 Deansgate in a moment, but the first scheme that really came out of that whole process was Urbis. And again, it's something that Manchester is good at, is levering into the city some public funding. And at the time, we had the art gallery and we had museums. And there was this thing called Millennium Funding that actually nobody really knew what it was. But the city council were quite good at putting together a case for, we'll have some of that money, we'll build a building and we'll find a use for it. So this became a Museum of the City, which was only really ever going to exist for a relatively short period of time. Certainly in our mind, we were designing a building that had to be very flexible, almost like a Victorian building, that could change and respond to different uses. And okay, the building, this is the 3rd iteration, and it's now a museum, and it can be called a museum in a sense because it couldn't it was Millennium Funding because there wasn't any extra funding from museums, but times moved on, and 15, 18 years later, you can start to change the use, and we've got a fantastic asset within the city that, working with BDP Landscape, developed Cathedral Gardens, and that in itself was a very, very important stepping stone to the north. It was important that this building and this investment in the city was placed north of Market Street. It was important that it became a catalyst, not only for the redevelop of Cheetham's, and there's a fantastic new music school that's being developed there, but also the work that's gone on in Victoria Station, the investment that's going to go on adjacent to that, the whole of the NOMA vision for residential, for offices, for new public spaces, the regeneration of existing listed but derelict buildings, the redevelopment of the Printworks as a leisure centre. Whether you like the architecture or not, it's actually brought life and vitality to that part of the city. And latterly, the redevelopment, probably for the 2nd or 3rd time, of the Corn Exchange that we were involved in in terms of setting the parameters for that, actually just stripping the building back to its original, the essence of the original building, but creating, again, turning it outwards a little bit with restaurants and cafes and street furniture. Don't forget, it wasn't very long ago when Manchester wasn't allowed to have cafe pavements. If you remember, what was the name of that? Please, pardon? Manto was the first, and there's a story about, anyway, I won't go about Manto, but we nearly bought it as an office. We offered £17,000 for Manto building, and then Carroll jumped in and usurped us and made a fantastic asset out of it. So that was a good building to lose. But it wasn't very long ago when you couldn't have street furniture. Anderson it was, wasn't it, the police? Yeah. James Anderton, wasn't it? Yeah. Who, crazy guy in terms of, that's why we had a 9-to-5 city. The city was about a place that you worked in, and then you retreated back to the leafy suburbs. You enjoyed yourself back there. You didn't actually spend time in the city centre. I think when you look at Urbis, it's changed. It's had restaurants. Hopefully those will come back. Buildings need to evolve and develop and grow, and hopefully this building is robust enough to be able to sustain change and sustain new uses and welcome those new uses. Public spaces like Piccadilly Gardens, like Cathedral Gardens here, they all change. I mean, this has become the centre, the world centre for goths. Who would have thought of that? But that's great. If they want to gather here and trample all the grass, perfect, but we just need to design surfaces that can accommodate that. And again, at the time when we designed this building, it was about creating a series of very flexible floor plates that could be opened. There was a sense of visibility. You arrived, you turned. There was a lift, a funicular, as we called it, that took you up to the top of the building, and you cascaded down. And now it's a building that's attracting 500, 600,000 people into Manchester every year, which is adding to the perception of change that is fundamental to what we all do. We've talked about, I unfortunately missed the beginning of the session, but to me, we as architects are very much supporting a political ambition which is about levering in investment. We're trying to find a new role for a city like Manchester. We have, no matter what people say, we have accelerated change through the bomb. It's allowed the city to reconfigure some of its infrastructure, some of its streets. There's been an ambition to change and bring in new people living in the city. You know, I've been a great advocate of residential in the city. We've got 20,000 people living in the city core now. Maybe in 20, 30 years' time, that might be 150 to 200,000, which itself will drive demand for all sorts of other things into the city centre. One of the other buildings that spun out of this was the transport interchange, again, a project that we got involved with, which happens to be a multi-storey car park that's got a bus station under it that came out of the Arndale, and it's got a tram stop. And what a fantastic asset the tram station is. The tram line and Second City Crossing coming through now, despite the fact that you can't move in Manchester for roadworks. You know, in a year or two, that will be completely removed. And this was a real challenge. How do you design a car park on a very visible site? Effectively, we developed a whole series of ideas about transparency and movement and light, picking up on the theme of glazing that we've applied to a number of our buildings. But also, you've got to naturally ventilate those sorts of buildings. So we use the texture and the grid of the cladding to create something that I think this is one of the best car parks. Certainly, every other car park we've ever designed, they can't even afford cladding on it. You know, it's been very difficult. In First Street, we designed a car park there as part of that, a recession project. Very minimal cladding on it. It's surrounded by other buildings, but this was very much a beacon and needed to be a strong marker, a sign of confidence for the city. And number 1, Deansgate. This was a site, if you remember the plan, at the junction of Deansgate and St Mary's Gate. And when we were looking at the master plan, it's the site that the landowners said had least value in terms of retail, because we're creating this new route through New Cathedral Street. We managed to lever in Harvey Nichols, Selfridges, Marks and Spencer's were relocated. Fantastic retail offers into Manchester for the first time. And then there was a bit of site opposite the old Ramada Hotel, which is pretty derelict in itself, that they said, actually, that doesn't have any value. If you want to put some residential, that's the site for it. So we worked very carefully with the city and with Crosby Homes to develop number 1 Deansgate. Only a small number of apartments, 84 I think, sitting on a podium over a very limited amount of retail, but that retail was almost amenity retail related to the residential blocks. And those buildings are actually separated from the rest of the commercial by about 50 millimeters. It had to be literally that red line. You couldn't have the overlap of uses that you would automatically expect now. And certainly we were developing New Cathedral Street, which certainly have other uses on top of those buildings. I remember we were looking at how can we give it scale? How can we make scale on that street when basically all the retailers wanted was the ground floor? So it was quite a hard battle, but working with them to create a sense of urbanity effectively to the place. Again, these residents actually set the highest values in Manchester at the time, bearing in mind that you can't build a building in London for what you sell a building for in Manchester, yeah? It's a completely different world. We're trying to build buildings and create public spaces in a city where the values are virtually on the floor. You think it's a lot of money when you say £300,000 for an apartment. Actually, in terms of retail in the city centre, it's very difficult to build buildings for much less than that. And in London, as I say, it's a completely different world. And we're trying to compete as a city for investment, for new jobs, for wealth, and to change the perception of the city. We're all about waving to the rest of the world, in a sense, and saying, bring your jobs to Manchester, invest in this city. Everyone can then benefit from those jobs and that wealth creation. We're not just creating buildings for the sake of it. It's actually about changing the perception of the flat caps that everyone outside of beyond Watford, below Watford, thinks still exists in Manchester. It's a slow process. And we're probably halfway through that perception change. But some of the things that the City Council are doing and the longevity and the continuity that we have in the City Council allows long-term thinking, long-term planning in terms of the airport, in terms of Airport City, in terms of the placing of the Etihad Stadium in a run-down piece of the city so that ultimately those parts will be connected. It's all about that sort of vision. There was no point in putting all your wealthy stadiums on your riverfront, as they do in Liverpool. It's about placing them in areas that needs that sort of investment. And I think Manchester's been extremely successful in that respect. I think it's very easy to criticise, but if you look at any other city outside of London, global city, not just UK city, there's a sense of confidence, I think. And we all know that Manchester has a can-do attitude, that and it doesn't matter whether you're an artist, whether you're a musician, or whatever, we all just want to get on and do it. We're not really bothered about everyone else, but we want people to love our city and to invest in it. And the creation of good quality architecture, but importantly, exceptionally special spaces, is something that I think Manchester's been very successful at achieving. Again, highest values back in 2002, and it's only now, after the Great Recession, where we saw no cranes, that we're starting to see cranes on our skyline again, and values getting back to those sorts of levels. That's me done. I mean, I'm happy to answer some questions and queries. Obviously, since then, over the last 15 years, Manchester's moved on tremendously in terms of new neighbourhoods. You know, we're looking at spinning fields. What a fantastic asset that is for the city. We're also looking at St John's, linking Castlefield. We've got Great Jackson Street. We've got other areas around the city starting to fill in that donut of dereliction and empty space and try and increase the density within the city so that hopefully we can compete, not just regionally, not just nationally, but internationally for investment. Thank you.